Hello everyone. In this video, I want to cover Packet Tracer 4.3.8. So this is module 4. So this Packet Tracer cover the layer 3 switch and the Inter-VLAN routing. Remember in previous video, we talked about there are 3 different methods to do Inter-VLAN routing. The previous video we did router on the stick. That's the second methods of the 3. This is the third methods, would be using a layer 3 switch to do Inter-VLAN routing. So what is a layer 2 switch versus a layer 3 switch? What's the difference there? So normally a layer 2 switch would not have the capability to do any routing versus a layer 3 switch. Now it is enabled on a layer 3 switch that you could do VLAN routing or inter-VLAN routing by using the SVI. Okay. So essentially the benefits of using a layer 3 switch is that you might not need a router to do the routing functions anymore. You could use that layer 3 switch, turn it into a router in a sense to do routing, as well as doing the layer 2 on that switch. So it is called a multi-layer switch by the implying the names of that capability of the switch. All right, so let's get into the packet tracer configuration here. So the objective is, for part 1, we need to configure a layer 3 switching. Part 2, we need to configure the inter-VLAN routing on that layer 3 switch. And then part 3 would be IP version 6, inter-VLAN routing. Okay, so part 1, let's log into the MLS. That stands for multi-layer switch. And then we want to configure a routed port. Okay, so let's look into this. So okay, so if we go to interface gig 0/2, okay, so by default, this interface, it's a layer 2 interface, meaning I cannot put an IP address on this interface. So let me give you a look here. I get an error. See, this command, this syntax doesn't work on a layer 2 interface, even it is on a multi-layer switch. So this is a layer 3 switch, but by default, its interfaces are at layer 2, meaning you cannot add an IP address on that interface. So what we're trying to do here is to convert this multi-layer switch interface, gig 02, into a layer 3 interface, kind of like a router. You put an IP on it, right? So in order for you to do that, you have to do a no switch port commands to turn this interface to a layer 3. After that, you can put the IP address. Just like that, and no shot, okay? So that is how you configure a routed port or interface on a layer 3 switch. Okay, so now we want to ping to test the connectivity of that interface. So I'm pinging the cloud based on topology and I get a reply. All right, so part 1 is complete. Part 2, configure inter-VLAN routing. All right, so we need to create VLANs and SVI for that VLAN, virtual switch interface for that VLAN. And then we're going to assign an IP address for the SVI. So let's begin with adding VLAN 10 and the IP and name it staff. We want to add VLAN 20. Name it student. And then add VLAN 30. And name it faculty. Okay. Once you create the VLAN, you need to create an SVI, right? So this essentially is the sort of a gateway for the VLAN. So we need to build interface VLAN 10. We can put the IP address. No, so here you don't need to do no switch port, okay? An SVI automatically assume that it is a layer 3. So you can add IP address. Okay, and do a no shut as well. You can do interface VLAN 20 IP address 168.20.254. Okay, I want to point out something. You guys see I'm moving the configurations. When I'm doing the configurations, I'm moving from one subconfig mode to the next without having to do the exit and go back to global config mode and then change to a different config mode. Now I could do that if you know the command, but if you don't, you could always try to go back to the global config mode and then change to the subconfig mode that you want to do. So for example, right, I go into subconfig for interface VLAN 10, I'd assign the IP address, do a no shutdown. As for when you guys start getting to COI, at this point, you could do exit, go back to global config mode, and then enter interface VLAN 20, and then assign the IP address in that subconfigurations of VLAN 20. Okay, you could do that, or you could just go straight to it like I did here. Okay, whichever. So I'm done with interface VLAN 20 configure here. So let me demonstrate. So I could exit, go back to global config mode, and then enter subconfig for VLAN 30, enter the IP address, just like that. Or I could go directly into a different subconfig for VLAN 99, right? And as an example, and I would just do the config that way. So the IP addresses that I'm assigning to these interfaces are based on obviously the table that's given here. Okay, so follow that. Let me check to make sure I have everything correct. I'm on part 2. All right. Step 1. Step 2. All right, perfect. Okay, so at this point, I think I'm done with step 2 for part 2. All right. So for step 3, we need to configure the trunk. Remember what's a trunk is, right? So because there are multiple VLANs here, so we need a trunk to be able to carry all different VLAN tags, right? VLAN 20, VLAN 10, VLAN 30. So if we look at the topology, the interface, this interface here, we go into option, turn on the label, right? This interface here need to be able to carry multiple VLANs, 10, 20, 30, 99, right? So it needs to be a trunk, okay? So we need to go to GIG interface 01 and switch port mode trunk. And we want to set the native VLAN 99 because we changed the default native VLAN from 1 to 99. Okay. Then we want to do the switch trunk encapsulation protocol .1q. Okay. So .1q is I believe it's a standard for the trunk encapsulations protocol. Okay. Now we're done with the MOS switch. We need to, because the trunk need to be negotiated between the two switches here. If you assign the trunk or made the trunk for the interface, right? On this switch, you have to make the trunk for this the other switch as well, right? So in this case, we need to go to S1 and turn the interface that connect to the multi-layer switch as a trunk as well. So we on step 4 here. Interface GIG01 on switch 1, switch port mode trunk. So we want to do it statically, right? So remember, there's different way to configure an interface as trunk. We can do it static, we can do it dynamic, right? And we want to also match the native VLAN that configure on the other side, which is 99. If you don't match the native VLAN, you're gonna see a mismatched VLAN or span and tree message that keep popping up. Right, so we want to make sure we don't have that error. Okay, so at this point we are done with step 4 on part 2. So step 5, we need to go back to the multi-layer switch and configure or verify your routing, right? So routing, once you get into later chapters, there are a lot more concept to understand, but essentially routing is a process on the routers that it's finding a way to send the communication from one networks to the others, right? So that's what routing's essentially is for. So on a layer 2 switch, there's no routing. But on a layer 3 switch, that's another difference here between the layer 2 and layer 3 switch. You can do routing as well. So in this case, we want different VLANs or different networks, right, to route to one another. So for a layer 3 switch, we need to enable routing in the switch, right? So, and if you do, so show IP route, and this is very important commands in the later chapter. So show IP route will show a database, a routing database table inside the device. And this is kind of like a map for the router to look at the table, right, to identify where the traffic should go. Okay, so for this switch, layer 3 switch, by default it does not have a routing table, right? Obviously newer Cisco device, they enable this automatically for layer 3 switch, but some old legacy device that I've seen during my work years, you need to enable this command, IP routing, to turn the switch into an actual routing device, to have the routing table. Okay, so this is what step 3 is trying to get you to understand. So enable routing, so I did that. So now before that, there's no routing table, right? You can see here if I do show IP route on top of here. So once I enable IP routing, I'm going to do show IP route again. Now you can see, right, this is the routing table. Okay, all right, at this point we could test a couple connectivities between the PCs and see what we've done as for inter-VLAN routing on a layer 3 switch successfully. So on PC 0, I'm going to command prompt, and I'm going to try to ping PC 3, and the IP of PC 3 is 192.168.10.2. And I do get a reply. So that means what we've done so far, we're good. Okay. All right. So let's move to the last part of the packet tracer. All right, part 3. So we need to configure IP version 6 inter-VLAN routing. So this step here is just to get you familiar with how to assign IP version 6 on an interface again, and how to enable IP version 6 routing on the multi-layer switch. So let's start with the MLS switch. So IP version 6 unicast routing. So this is similar to the IP routing up here command, but instead of turning on IP version 4 routing table with IP routing, you turn it on IP version 6 routing table with IP version 6 unicast routing command. Okay. Now let assign the SVI an IP version 6 address. We already done IP version 4. Now we need to go back and do an IP version 6. So the syntax is IP version 6 address, and then the format of the IP version 6 IP address. So at this point, just copy what's on this lap here. I'll explain the format of IP version 6 in a later chapter. Okay, so let's do that for VLAN 20 as well. So these addresses here are from the table, right? So we just follow on that. All right, so let's also add another IP version 6 address on interface gig 0 for step 3. All right, so let's do a show IP version 6 routes. And you can see this is the routing table for IP version 6. It looks a little bit complicated here, but once you're familiar with IP version 6 addresses, it's not that bad. All right, at this point we get 100% completion here, which means we finish everything. Obviously, you should test the connectivity with using IP version 6. For example, let's do one here. So let's go to PC3, and then let's ping IP version 6 address. You get a reply. Okay. All right. And that's it for this packet tracer. And I will see you guys on the next packet tracer.